Part 1, Chapter 10b of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Part 1, The Man in the Case. Chapter 10b, The Alibi, continued. Over the unwashed face of Larry the Bat, a grey pallor spread slowly. His fingers were plucking at the frayed edge of his inside vest pocket. The dark eyes seemed to turn coal black. A laugh, like the laugh of one damned, rose to his lips and was choked back. It was gone. Gone! That thin metal case, like a cigarette case, that between the little sheets of oil paper held those diamond-shaped, grey-colored adhesive seals, the insignia of the Gray Seal, was gone. Clue. It seemed as though there were an overpowering nausea upon him. Clue. That little case was not a clue, it was a death warrant. His hands clenched fiercely. If he could only think for a moment. The lining of his pocket had given away. The case had dropped out. But there was nothing about the case to identify anyone as the Gray Seal, unless it were found in one's actual possession. Therefore, Whitey Mack, to have solved his identity, must have seen him drop the case. There could be no question about that. It was equally obvious, then, that Whitey Mack would know the Gray Seal as Larry the Bat. Did he also know him as Jimmie Dale? Yes or no? It was a vital question. His life hung on it. That keen, facile brain, numbed for the moment, was beginning to work with lightning speed. It was 4 o'clock that afternoon when he had assumed the character of Larry the Bat. Sometime between 4 o'clock and the present, it was now well after 11, the case had dropped from his pocket. There had been ample time then for Whitey Mack to have made that appointment with Lanigan, and ample time to have made a surreptitious visit to the sanctuary. Had Whitey Mack gone there? Had Whitey Mack found that hiding place in the flooring under the oilcloth? Had Whitey Mack discovered that the Gray Seal was not only Larry the Bat but Jimmie Dale? Jimmie Dale swept his hand across his forehead. It was damp from little clinging bits of moisture. Should he go to the sanctuary and change? Become Jimmie Dale again? Was it the safest thing to do, or the most dangerous? Even if Whitey Mack had been there and discovered the dual personality of Larry the Bat, how would he, Jimmie Dale, know it? The man would have been crafty enough to have left no sign behind him. Was it to the sanctuary that Whitey Mack meant to lead Lanigan that evening? Or did Whitey Mack know him as Jimmie Dale, and to make it the more sensational, plan to carry out the coup, say, at the St. James Club? Whitey Mack and Lanigan were still at Bristol Bob's. He had probably time, if he so elected, to reach the sanctuary, change, and get away again. But every minute was priceless now. What should he do? Run from the city as he was for cover, or take the gambler's chance? Whitey Mack knew him as Larry the Bat. it was not certain that Whitey Mack knew him as Jimmie Dale. He had halted, absorbed, in front of a moving picture theater. Great placards at first, but a blur of color, suddenly forced themselves in concrete form upon his consciousness. Letters a foot high leaped out at him. The double life. There was a picture of a banker in his private office, hastily secreting a forged paper as the hero, in the guise of a clerk, entered. The companion picture was the banker, in convict stripes, staring out from behind the barred doors of his cell. There seemed a ghastly augury in the coincidence. Why should a thing like that be thrust upon him to shake his nerve, when he needed nerve now more than he had ever needed it in his life before? He raised his hand to jack aimlessly at the brim of his hat, dropped his hand abruptly to his side again, and started quickly, hurriedly, away through the throng around him. A sort of savagery had swept upon him. In a flash, he had made his decision. He would take the gambler's chance, and afterward, Jimmie Dale's lips were like a thin straight line. It was Whitey Mack's life or his own. Whitey Mack had said he was the only one that was wise, and Whitey Mack had not told Lanigan yet. Wouldn't tell Lanigan until the showdown. If he, Jimmie Dale, got to the sanctuary, became Jimmie Dale, and got away again, even if Whitey Mack knew him as Jimmie Dale, there was still a chance. It was his life or Whitey Mack's. Whitey Mack with his lean-jawed, clean-shaven wolf's face. If he could get Whitey Mack before the other was ready to tell Lanigan, surely he had the right of self-preservation. Surely his life was as valuable as Whitey Mack's, as valuable as a man's who, as those in the secrets of the underworld knew well enough, had blood upon his hands, who lived by crime, who was a menace to the community. Had he not the right to preserve his own life at the expense of one such as that? He had never taken life. The thought was abhorrent. But was there any other way in event of Whitey Mack knowing him as Jimmie Dale? His back was against the wall. He was trapped. Certain death, and worse, dishonor stared him in the face. Lanigan and Whitey Mack would be together. The odds would be 2-1 against him, and he had no quarrel with Lanigan. Somehow, he must let Lanigan out of it. The other side of the street was less crowded. He crossed over, and still with the shuffling tread that dozens around him knew as the characteristic gait of Larry the Bat, but covering the ground with amazing celerity, he hurried along. It was only at the end of the block, that cross street from the Bowery that led to the sanctuary. How much time had he? He turned the corner into the darker cross street. Whitey Mack would have learned from Bristol Bob that Larry the Bat had just been there. That is, that Larry the Bat was not at the sanctuary. Whitey Mack would probably be in no hurry. He and Lanigan might wait until later, until Whitey Mack should be satisfied that Larry the Bat had gone home. It was the line of least resistance. They would not attempt to scour the city for him. They might even wait in that private room at Bristol Bob's until they decided that it was time to sally out. He might perhaps still find them there when he got back. At any rate, from there he must pick up their trail again. On the other hand, all this was but supposition. They might make at once for the sanctuary, to lie in wait for him. In any case, there was need, desperate need for haste. He glanced sharply around him, and by the side of the tenement house, now that bordered onto the alleyway, with a curious, swift gliding motion, he seemed to blend into the shadow and darkness. It was the sanctuary, that room on the first floor of the tenement that had 3 entrances, 3 exits, a passageway through to the saloon on the next street that abutted on the rear, the usual front door, and the side door in the alleyway. Gone was the shuffling gait. Quick, alert, he ran, crouching, bent down along the alleyway, reached the side door, opened it stealthily, closed it behind him with equal caution, and in the dark entry stood motionless, listening intently. There was no sound. He began to mount the rickety, dilapidated stairs, and where it seemed that the lightest tread must make them creak out in blatant protest, his trained muscles, delicately compensating his body weight, carried him upward with a silence that was almost uncanny. There was need of silence as there was need of haste. He was not so sure now of the time at his disposal that he had even reached the sanctuary first. How long had he loitered in that half-dazed way on the Bowery? He did not know. Perhaps longer than he had imagined. There was the possibility that Whitey Mack and Lannigan were already above, waiting for him. But even if they were not already there and he got away before they came, it was imperative that no one should know that Larry the Bat had come and gone. He reached the landing and paused again, his right hand, with a vicious muzzle of his automatic peeping down from between his fingers, thrown a little forward. It was black, utterly black around him. Again, that stealthy, cat-like tread, and his ear was at the keyhole of the sanctuary door. A full minute, priceless though it was, passed. Then, satisfied that the room was empty, he drew his head back from the keyhole, and those slim tapering fingers that in their tips seemed to embody all the human senses felt over the lock. Apparently, it had been undisturbed, but that was no proof that Whitey Mack had not been there after finding the metal case. Whitey Mack was known to be clever with a lock, clever enough for that anyhow. He slipped in the key, turned it, and on hinges that were always oiled, silently pushed the door open and stepped across the threshold. He closed the door until it was just ajar, that any sound might reach him from without, and whipping off his coat, began to undress swiftly. There was no light. He dared not use the gas. It might be seen from the alleyway. He was moving now quickly, surely, silently, here and there. It was like some weird spectre figure, a little blacker than the surrounding darkness, flitting about the room. The oilcloth in the corner was turned back, the loose flooring lifted, the clothes of Jimmie Dale taken out, the rags of Larry the Bat put in. The minutes flew by. It was not the change of clothing that took long. It was the eradication of Larry the Bat's makeup from his face, throat, neck, wrists, and hands. Occasionally, his head was turned in a tense, listening attitude, but always the fingers were busy, working with swift deftness. It was done at last. Larry the Bat had vanished, and in his place stood Jimmie Dale, the young millionaire, the social lion of New York, immaculate in well-tailored tweeds. He stooped to the hole in the flooring, and his fingers, going unerringly to their hiding place, took out a black silk mask and an electric flashlight. His automatic was already in his possession. His lips parted grimly. Who knew what part a flashlight might not play? And he would need the mask for Lanigan's benefit, even if it did not disguise him from Whitey Mack. Had he left any telltale evidence of his visit? It was almost worth the risk of a light to make sure. He hesitated, then shook his head, and stooping again, carefully replaced the flooring and laid the oilcloth over it. He dared not show a light at any cost. But now, even more caution than before was necessary. At times, the lodgers had naturally enough seen their fellow lodger, Larry the Bat, enter and leave the tenement. None had ever seen Jimmie Dale either leave or enter. He stole across the room to the door, halted to assure himself that the hall was empty, slipped out into the hall, and locked the door behind him. Again, that trained, long-practiced, silent tread upon the stairs. It seemed as though an hour passed before he reached the bottom, and his brain was shrieking at him to hurry, hurry, hurry. The entryway at last, the door, the alleyway, a long breath of relief, and he was on the cross street. A step, two, he took in the direction of the Bowery, and he was bending down as though to tie his shoe, his automatic from his side pocket concealed in his hand. Was that someone there? He could have sworn he saw a shadow-like form start out from behind the steps of the house on the opposite side of the street as he had emerged from the alleyway. In his bent posture, without seemingly turning his head, his eyes swept sharply up and down the other side of the ill-lighted street. Nothing. There was not even a pedestrian in sight on the block from there to the Bowery. Jimmie Dale straightened up nonchalantly and stooped almost instantly again, as though the lace were still proving refractory. Again, that sharp, searching glance. Again, nothing. He went forward now in apparent unconcern, but his right hand, instead of being buried in his coat pocket, swung easily at his side. It was strange, his ineffective ruse to the contrary. He was certain that he had not been mistaken. Was it Whitey Mack? Was the question answered? Was the Gray Seal known too as Jimmie Dale? Were they trailing him now with the climax to come at the club, at his own palatial home, wherever the surroundings would best lend themselves to assuaging that inordinate thirst for the sensational that was so essentially a characteristic of the confirmed criminal? What a headline in the morning's papers it would make. At the corner, he loitered by the curb to light a cigarette. Still not a soul in sight on either side of the street behind him, except a couple of Italians who had just passed by. Strange again, the intuition, if it were only intuition, was still strong. He swung abruptly on his heel, mingled with the passers-by on the Bowery, walked a rapid half-dozen steps until the building hit the cross street, then ran across the road to the opposite side of the Bowery, and in a crowd now came back to the corner. He crossed from curb to curb slowly, sheltered by a fringe of people that, however, in no way obstructed his view down the side street. And then Jimmie Dale shrugged his shoulders. He had evidently been mistaken after all. He was overexcited. His nerves were raw. That, perhaps, was the solution. Meanwhile, every minute was counting. If Whitey Mack and Lanigan should still be at the Bristol Bobs. He kept on down the Bowery, hurrying with growing impatience through the crowds that massed in front of various places of amusement. He had not intended to come along the Bowery, and except for what had occurred, would have taken a less frequented street. He would turn off at the next block. He was in front of that moving picture theater again, the Double Life. His eyes were attracted involuntarily to the lurid, overdone display. It seemed to threaten him. It seemed to dangle before him a premonition, as it were, of what the morning held in store. But now, too, it seemed to feed into flame that smoldering fury that possessed him. His life or Whitey Mack's. Men, women, and the children who turned night into day in that quarter of the city were clustered thick around the signs, hiving like bees to the bald sensationalism. Almost savagely, he began to force his way through the crowd, and the next instant, like a man stunned, had stopped in his tracks. His fingers had closed in a fierce, spasmodic clutch over an envelope that had been thrust suddenly into his hand. "Jimmie," from somewhere came a low, quick voice. "Jimmie, it is 11:30 now. Hurry." He whirled, scanning wildly this face, then that. It was her voice, the tocsin. The sensitive fingers were telegraphing to his brain, as they always did, that the texture of the envelope too was hers. Her voice. Yes, anywhere out of 1,000 voices he would distinguish hers. But her face, he had never seen that. Which out of all the crowd around him was hers? Surely he could tell by her dress. She would be different. Her personality alone must single her out. Say, have you got the pipe? Or do you think yours owns the yachts? A man flung at him, heaving and pushing to get by. With a start, though he scarcely heard the man, Jimmie Dale moved on. His brain was afire. All the irony of the world seemed masked in a sudden, overwhelming attack upon him. It was useless. Intuitively, he had known it was useless from the instant he had heard her voice. It was always the same. Always. For years, she had eluded him like that, come upon him without warning and disappeared, but leaving always that tangible proof of her existence. A letter, the call of the Gray Seal to arms. But tonight, it was as it had never been before. It was not alone baffled chagrin now, not alone the longing, the wild desire to see her face, to look into her eyes. It was life and death. She had come at the very moment when she, perhaps alone of all the world, could have pointed the way out. When life, liberty, everything that was common to them both was at stake, in deadly peril, and she had gone, ignorant of it all, leaving him staggered by the very possibility of the succor that was held up before his eyes, only to be snatched away without power of his to grasp it. His intuition had not been at fault. He had made no mistake in that shadow across the street from the sanctuary. It had been the Tocsin. He had been followed, and it was she who had followed him, until in a crowd she had seized the opportunity of a moment ago. Though ultimately, perhaps it changed nothing, it was a relief in a way to know that it was she, not Whitey Mack, who had been lurking there. But her persistent, incomprehensible determination to preserve the mystery with which she surrounded herself was like now to cost them both a ghastly price. If he could only have had one word with her, just one word. The letter in his hand crackled under his clenched fist. He stared at it in a half-blind, half-bitter way. The call of the Gray Seal to arms. Another coup, with its incident, danger, and peril that she had planned for him to execute. He could have laughed loud at the inhuman mockery of it. The call of the Gray Seal to arms. Now, when with every faculty drained to its last resource, cornered, trapped, he was fighting for his very existence. Jimmie Dale, it is 11:30 now. Hurry. The words were jangling discordantly in his brain. And now he laughed outright, mirthlessly. A young girl hanging on her escort's arm, passing, glanced at him and giggled. It was a different Jimmie Dale for the moment. For once, his immobility had forsaken him. He laughed again, a sort of unnatural, desperate indifference to everything falling upon him. What did it matter, the moment or two it would take to read the letter? He looked around him. He was on the corner in front of the Palace Saloon, and turning abruptly, he stepped in through the swinging doors. As Larry the Bat, he knew the place well. At the rear of the bar room and along the side of the wall were some half-dozen little stalls, partitioned off from each other. Several of these were unoccupied, and he chose the one farthest from the entrance. It was private enough. No one would disturb him. From the aproned individual who presented himself, he ordered a drink. The man returned in a moment, and Jimmie Dale tossed a coin on the table, bidding the other to keep the change. He wanted no drink. Transaction was wholly perfunctory. The waiter was gone, pushed the glass away from him, and tore the envelope open. End of part 1, chapter 10b.